The Performance Studies graduate group at the University of California, Davis, is a group that emerged out of a performance studies PhD that was started in 1997 by a group of performance studies critics and scholars, Bill Worthen, Janelle Reinhold, Sue Ellen Case, and Susan Foster. They ran the PhD for 4 or 5 years, and then, as happens in academic life, they moved on to other things. And there was a hiatus of about 2 years where the PhD was sort of technically there, but there was nobody running it. Peter Lichtenfels was hired as it's called a target of excellence at UC Davis. He's a theater director and a critic. University of California has a partner program, so they brought me in as well. My name is Lynette Hunter. And I had come from about 10 years in the UK of working on the periphery of what was then called nothing else but practice as research. And Robin Nelson is one of the big names in that area, and was at the time, and has produced many books since then. My interest in this was actually working with Peter Lichtenfels, who is my partner, on an edition of Romeo and Juliet, where I was the bibliographer and he was the theatre person. Although I have a lot of theatre in my background, I had never had the experience of working very, very closely with somebody who was basically in the pure arts on a critical matter. And what I discovered in that 10 years that it took us to do this edition of Romeo and Juliet was that he had this extraordinary access to ways of thinking and knowing and being with an artwork, with a text that I had absolutely really no idea about. There was no vocabulary in my scholarly world for what he was talking about. Just as much, there wasn't any vocabulary in his world for what we were talking about. So when I was hired in 2003, partly to bring practice as research into the program at UC Davis, and I came from this background of practice as research in the UK, which was personally informed by this 10 years of realizing that I really didn't know about all the art making activities that were going into these materials that I used all the time. As a seasoned academic, that shocked me. And I felt that other people, particularly in my field, needed to know more about that. And I had seen a kind of similar thing happening in science. Part of my background is also as a scientist and as somebody interested in the history of science and somebody interested in feminist studies and science and technology. And I had seen a similar kind of recognition of alternate ways of knowing and being in that whole field that had emerged from the 1970s, 80s into the 90s, people like Donna Haraway and Hilary Rose, Sandra Harding, and people like that. So it wasn't just performance studies. I could see this happening in other places. The program, when I got here, was the PhD program in the Department of Theatre and Dance, which made sense because theatre and dance was one of the few places in the university where the body was attributed with a way of knowing. The people in theatre and dance didn't really articulate that as a critical vocabulary when I arrived, although they were beginning to. I felt really at home in this place where people were trying very hard to generate new insights about all sorts of different kinds of things through their bodies. One of the key people in that was not only my partner, Peter Lichtenfels, but also Della Davidson, a rather wonderful Bay Area dancer who was at that stage in charge of running the dance side of the program. And she worked with the geography department, she worked with a whole bunch of different departments in the university in a very interdisciplinary way. I was asked when I arrived to set up what we call at UC Davis a designated emphasis. A designated emphasis means that you take your straightforward PhD in whatever it is. You could do it in English literature, you could do it in environmental studies, you could do it in whatever, and then you added on, like a minor at an undergraduate level, you added on an emphasis in something else. And you could have more than one emphasis. The plan was that we would have an emphasis in performance studies. The PhD would continue to be centered in theatre and dance. The designated emphasis would be something that would be university-wide. So for the next year, I went around to all these different departments and said, well, this is obviously something that would apply to your department or your ideas, or it must be of interest to you. And just about everybody agreed. We formed the designated emphasis the following year. I guess we're talking now about 2005. And we started taking in PhD students who were really interested in practices research. Coming into the United States from Europe, I was warned that if the students in this PhD with a focus on practices research did not look like normal PhD students when they graduated, they would have a great difficulty getting academic jobs if they wanted them. Number one, we weren't sure that we were looking for people who were interested just in academic jobs, but we have a responsibility to produce people, produce is the right word here, who would be recognized as having the scholarly skills and the critical skills as well as the practical skills. So over the next 3 years, 4 years, up to about 2009, 2010, I worked with various people in the designated emphasis, and collectively, we hammered out an approach that would, we hoped, allow practices research to gain recognition in the university as an arts area with its own articulation of vocabulary and critical world, at the same time as trying to encourage students to interface with the various different scholarly disciplines that were already here at UC Davis. So by about 2009, 2010, we went back to graduate studies and said, look, this designated emphasis is very popular. We would like to have, instead of a PhD in a department, we would like to have a PhD program that was a graduate group and involved a lot of different departments. This suited the theatre and dance department quite well because they had a large number of MFA students. There were not enough TA or associate instructor positions or graduate student researcher positions to satisfy both that MFA and the PhD. And they voted to allow the PhD to go into a graduate group. We then put this in front of graduate studies. They passed it. So we then have the last 13 to 15 years of trying to refine, well, what does it mean to have a graduate group, giving a doctoral degree in an area which is scholarly, but also practical. Now, for a scientist, this isn't a problem because they deal with this all the time. The work that you generate from that lab, you might even have some theory in there somewhere, but you have a history of dealing with scientific research and scholarship that goes quite seamlessly, well, maybe not seamlessly, but it goes along with the laboratory work and the experimental side and the mechanical side, because the mechanics of science is an experiment in itself. It wasn't at all surprising to us, the people who were in that designated emphasis and took it forward, that graduate studies, which is largely occupied by scientists, recognized what we wanted to do without any problem. And so we moved forward on that basis, taking quite a lot of clues from things that people in the sciences were doing. One of the things that people in the sciences were doing was they not only had the split between a kind of scholarly theoretical science and a much more practically based science, they also, in some departments, had what they call a professional PhD program. And the third arm to the graduate group was this professional PhD, which we decided we would only really recruit people who had done at least 30, 40 years or whatever. They'd done a very long time and they wanted to talk about their career retrospectively and analyze it and critique it and bring it into a greater circulation in the world of arts and humanities scholarship. We only had 3 or 4 graduates from that particular line before we realized that it was not really taking off in the way we wanted to. So we closed it down. And in about 2014, 2015, we stopped taking people into that stream, and we were left with the primary streams that the PhD now had, which are mainstream traditional scholarship and a mixture of that kind of scholarship and practice. Okay, so that's the background to the program. To say just a short thing about the 2 different kinds of PhD. One of them is something that will be recognized as a normative humanities PhD. It's scholarly, it's critical, it's historical often, And it's based on reading books and creating bibliographies and writing things and that kind of thing. And the other one is a PhD that does all of that, but it also has an element of practice. And the only real difference between the two is that for the qualifying examination, which every PhD in the United States has 2 to 3 years into the program, you have to have a portfolio of practice. And we also decided that this wasn't a place where we wanted people to find a practice and try to develop it while they were here. We wanted people who already had a practice coming in, maybe developing it further, but creating a vocabulary, creating critical insight, creating these alternative ways or ulterior ways of knowing and being and thinking and existing from work that they already knew to a very considerable and intimate extent. So we sort of said arbitrarily 10 years, and you really need to have that before you can come into the practice as research strand. And you need to declare that you're going to do it when you come in. You can't sort of come in on the mainstream and then decide that you're going to go across. Now that may change. All these things are flexible. Nothing is written in stone in some ways, but those are the two primary strands. People in practice as research sometimes go on at the dissertation level after the qualifying exam to develop further elements of their practice in whatever materials they are using. They could be using visual arts, they could be using music, they could be using voice, they could be interested in performances of gender, they could be interested in environmental performance. I mean, it's a very, very wide program that goes across a number of different disciplines in the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences and the arts. So it's a graduate group that has over 50 faculty members contributing to it. The key thing for an incoming student is to find somebody they want to work with and to approach them to make sure that the faculty member also wants to work with them, because there isn't much point coming into a program anywhere unless you know that there are people who are going to welcome you, people you want to learn from and learn with. Those are the two different elements of the program. That's the differences. And if you were considering, if anyone were considering coming into the program, then they would need to really look through the faculty. The website normally has the various different areas that the faculty are interested in. These are not formal areas, but when we realized that we had so many faculty, we asked them to tell us whether they were interested in one of 4 strands. These are not formal strands. There are simply ways to help students and faculty connect to each other because they know they've got a bit of a focus in one area or another. The strands are cultural ecologies. That often covers things like decolonizing or environmental things, history, text. Then there's the intermedial group who work very much on digital technologies and cinema and film and games and various other things like that. And finally, the embodied. These 4 strands, most faculty, when they come in and join the group, they will say, well, I'm interested in digital and I'm interested in history text. And that will go beside their entry on the website. So that a student who's thinking, or a person who's thinking of coming here, can see in general what a particular faculty member thinks they're interested in. But if you've read something by that faculty member and it doesn't seem to, go with those particular categories, again, this is just general guidelines. People in this graduate group are very open, they're very experimental, they're constantly crossing disciplinary boundaries, and these categories may not fit in the way that a glove fits. So you may have to write to them and say, hello, who are you? How are you? This is what I'm interested in. Are you interested in this? Would it be a possibility that we could work together? So those 4 areas, though, are areas that in many ways, although they are very, very flexible, have also generated a lot of published writing, several books, a number of productions over the years that the program has been running. The program has a very distinct interest also in science and technology studies. That seems to me to be something that has always been there from the very beginning, because it does seem to me that the arts and the sciences can speak to each other far more easily than the humanities and the arts. The current chair of the program is also somebody who has developed and created the science and technology studies at the University of California, Davis. So that's my introduction.